and Her Royal Highness, the Crown Princess. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Jan Eliasson, Chair of the SIPRI Governing Board.
Thank you, dear ghost voice up there. I am a proud chair of the SIPRI Governing Board, but I have no control over the weather. I regret very much. This is not the way Stockholm usually welcomes people, but it was still beautiful seeing the water and the forests going in here. Welcome to this second security conference of SIPRI. It's a continuation of the conference that took place last year, which dealt about cities. And now this year, we are adding a little bit more of a somber note because it is the security of cities in an insecure world. And I think the point that is going to be made today is the fact that the security of cities is in fact a microcosm, a miniature of the security needed in this world. Cities are struggling with environmental protection, of course the challenge of sustainability, the possibility of climate change affecting your cities, scarcities of resources, how do we deal with water, for instance, Crown Princess, one of your favorite subjects. And of course also security. Terrorism has struck Stockholm like many other cities recently, cities which should be very safe and secure. We have also migration of refugees. We have fantastic visitors here from other places dealing with the refugees and migration issues. How do we make sure that we are cities where we live together and where we have really a true sense of togetherness? So, in fact, the whole idea is that we look at the problems of today's world from the city perspective, but they are definitely relevant for all these global challenges that we had of us. I will be very brief and just first of all thank some of you here in this room. I want to thank Your Majesty and Your Royal Highness for being here today, and by that showing your interest and your engagement in these issues, which relate to peace and war, but also sustainability and how we live together. That you are staying so long during the day is a sign of how thorough you want to pursue the subjects. Also, I want to welcome the Speaker of the Parliament, my friend Urban Ahlin. I'm from Gothenburg, so I hope you don't mind if I say that he's an expert in urban affairs. Yeah, right. And I then also want to welcome another friend, Ulrika Moder, the State Secretary from the Ministry of International Development, and Karin Vangård, the Mayor of the city of Stockholm, who we will hear briefly from these colleagues. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, MSB, well known to the Swedes, who have partnered with us in this important conference. And I also want to pay respect and bring thanks to Mr. Per Taube, whose personal contribution to CIPRI and to this conference have made it possible at all. So thank you all very, very much. But, of course, due thanks and gratitude go to our very distinguished guests. And I cannot name them all. You will see and hear from them during the course of the day. But they represent the absolutely best in the knowledge of these issues that we discussed today. They have left their positions in their respective places, mostly capitals and cities, of course, and have come to Stockholm to join in at this very, very important conference. So I will want to thank you very much. We will have here voices from not only those who deal with the refugees issues in the world, like Filippo Grandi, one of my absolutely best friends in the UN, who served also in UNRWA, honorably and very faithfully for the UN and for the people. But also you will hear people from cities, from Rotterdam, from London, from Istanbul, from Sana, and many other urban areas. Regretfully not Aleppo, Raqqa, and Mosul, cities that are in a completely different shape today. I deeply regret that my dear friend and our dear friend Staffan de Mistura could not come because he's in Astana, Kazakhstan, to try to start the political talks necessary. And that theme will come back, the fact that we need to go to the root causes to avoid the destruction. So that you will see as a theme. So by this, my introduction is done. I want to warmly welcome you all to the conference, and I will ask a few of the people I've mentioned to come up here to the stage. And let me start by calling a person who represents the Swedish Parliament, of course, is the most prominent representative of the Parliament. And here I want to remind you all that CIPRI would not exist if it hadn't been for the Swedish Parliament, which in 1966 created CIPRI as a tribute to Sweden having lived in peace for 150 years. Since then, we have celebrated the 200-year anniversary of peace, and let's work hard that some of us will celebrate the 250-year anniversary. I don't know whether you will cover these themes, my dear friend Urban, but over to you, and we welcome now Urban Ahlin.
Thank you, John, and I'm very happy that you're organizing this conference to solve urban problems. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, esteemed panelists, and Your Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to open the Stockholm Security Conference now for the second year running. The Stockholm Security Conference is an annual event which I hope and believe will have increasing importance. We have gathered here in this beautiful place, Artipelag, in order to delve into complicated situations and questions. This year, as was the case at last year's conference, Discussions will concern security issue in relations to cities in which many of us live, and more and more. Discussions will also concern the world around us, security threats and challenges affecting cities. Cities, regions, and countries are all linked to each other. What happens in one country influences places far, far away. The horrors of the war in Syria often defy all descriptions, but they can actually be seen here in the eyes of the refugees, of a family getting off the train at Stockholm Central Station. Other issues in this age of urbanization concern the way in which cities and densely populated areas are working on resilience and contingency issues. Hurricanes like Harvey and Irma now, as well as vast floodings in many countries and cities in South Asia, put these questions in the spotlight. They also emphasize that the world must improve its efforts to deal with human and social challenges, for example, as a result of climate change, war, conflict, or organized crime. We have tools at our disposal, technologies and international cooperation, but they must be developed. As the challenges are growing, our efforts also must be increased. To do this, we need knowledge. SIPRI, as an independent source of know-how, and is an organization of world renown. The know-how and the credibility provided by SIPRI is needed when we orientate ourselves in the complex world of today. It is therefore positive that this year's conference on secure cities continues both to focus on security threats against cities, but also to discuss the great global trends that affect us in an insecure world. Terror is one such threat. When we met in Stockholm a year ago, I mentioned the bombing in Stockholm in 2010 in my opening address. Since then, we have been spared from terror here until a terrorist drove a lorry onto Drottninggatan in central Stockholm, leaving dead and injured in his tracks. Sadly, we have now joined a large number of afflicted cities such as Nice, Baghdad, London, Paris, Kabul, Manchester, Brussels, Turkey, Mogadishu, and so on and so on. Terrorism is a global threat. It is no longer possible to say it won't happen here. At the same time, I would like also to underline the decisiveness, the warmth, and the dignity that the people of Stockholm and inhabitants of other cities have shown each other after these terrible acts. The reactions and the way the authorities have dealt with the problems have shown that we can be resolute in the face of terror. These are examples of global threats and trends that we need to understand better if we are going to be able to deal with them. I'm convinced that this conference will provide a valid contribution to the knowledge necessary to further our understanding. With these words, I would like to thank you for your attention, and now it is time to get down to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Urban. We will get down to work, but we will first listen to Ulrika Moder and a few others. Ulrika Moder, the State Secretary of International Development Cooperation. I would like you to take the floor. You are representing the Swedish government at this occasion. Welcome, Ulrika.
I thought Jan was going to say that I was from Gothenburg as well, because I am. So I was enjoying the joke before. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm truly honored to have the possibility to be here with you today and address you in this opening note. And on behalf of the Swedish government, I would like to express our sincere thanks to SIPRI, to the Swedish Parliament, the City of Stockholm, and the Swedish Contingency Agency for arranging this important conference. Some years ago, SIPRI expanded its area of activities by establishing an annual international forum for exploring issues of the UN Millennium Goals, development strategies, and peacebuilding. Attending the forum has become a must for a large number of academics and officials in Sweden and abroad dealing with these issues. Since last year, as we were told, SIPRI has yet another conference leg, and that is the Stockholm Security Conference, furthering broadening SIPRI's international approach and outreach. And as a representative for the Swedish government, I'm very happy to say that we very much welcome this initiative. And the theme chosen for this conference, Secure Cities in an Insecure World, a topic of, as we have heard, great relevance and importance. And in particular, I welcome the way that this conference has been conceived in stages, beginning with the exploration of the complex and intertwined dimensions of contemporary world insecurity, continuing with presentations on how global strains have an impact on cities, and finally, and I think that this is very important, landing on a constructive note, and that is what cities such as those represented here can do, must do, but not least actually also do in response to those challenges. Because whereas governments have the responsibility to deal with military security threats, it often calls upon cities and regions to deal with a whole range of threats and challenges to human security. And the practical examples and learnings are at the local level. Today's headlines about extreme weather events, be it the hurricanes in the US, Harvey in Texas, and Irma in Caribbean and Florida, followed by others, or, as we also should remember, the disaster monsoon rains in India. These, of course, both exemplify issues of shared responsibilities between city level and national governments. But they also illustrate another phenomenon, and that is the way urbanization, also in response to migration, has tended to worsen the effects of natural disasters. In other parts of the world, climate change aspects are clearly linked to drought and also, unfortunately, famine. This in turn gives rise both to war and conflict and can also give rise to mass migration. It shows that the connection between climate change and security in the broadest sense are clear and they are present here and now. And these issues are highly prioritized by the Swedish government, and we welcome that SIPRI has decided to launch this very topical conference. The Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals is a true testament of impressive political will that was shown very few years ago. In 2015, global leaders did commit to leave no one behind. And they did commit to ambitious goals that actually can be part of the solution of the many problems that we see. The implementation of the Agenda 2030 and sustainable development is a main priority for the Swedish government, and we intend to plan our activities in line with the agenda. The promise of the agenda lies in its recognition that peace, security, climate change, environment, and development are closely interlinked. And this we know in Sweden. We have the experience, and we have it also through all our broad international relations. SDG 11 and its promotion of safe and inclusive and resilient cities represent a key goal of the 2030 agenda. And in the in-depth review of the SDG 11 that will be made in 2018, we will see that we will have an important opportunity to advance in the implementation of this work. So how do we more effectively prevent violent conflicts, and how do we build these inclusive social, political, and economic structures that constrain the forces of violence? And how do we secure cities in an insecure world? There is a new resolve in the international community to make sustaining peace a priority and prevention a priority. This includes the recognition that peace building is an inherently political process aimed at preventing the outbreak, escalation, recurrence, or continuation of conflict, and further recognizing that peace building encompasses a wide range of political, developmental, and human rights programs and mechanisms. A focus on sustaining peace could frame approaches in the city that build on the use of dialogue, trust building, consensus seeking, in order to resolve or manage conflict through non-violent means. And we do have a lot of experience to build on. For sustainable solutions, the process towards peace, stability, and development needs to be guided by inclusion. This entails ensuring and increasing the participation of women, of course, and this you know, since Sweden also has a feminist government with a feminist foreign policy, is a very important area of ours. But it also need to we also need to have an inclusive approach to youth and marginalized groups in all decision-making processes. Transparency, accountability, and non-discrimination needs to constitute the backbone of all our work. And political will, of course, is key and desperately needed at all levels to look for the solutions to the problems that we see. Climate change, and this I think we have seen the past week, is the most critical issue of our time. The negative consequences of climate change have not only the potential to undermine the development efforts and results that we have gained during the past decades, but it also presents a range of security challenges as a result of climate-related risks. And as always, people in poor, in fragile and conflict-affected countries are suffering the most from the effects of climate change, even though they have contributed very little to this. It is our responsibility, and we need to look upon this as a responsibility also for the global north. Climate change can exacerbate already insecure situations and drive increasing number of peoples to leave their home. This also affects how urbanization will develop over time, and the links between climate change and security must be urgently given the attention also in the light of conflict prevention. And this is also something that Sweden works with, also together with the support of SIPRI. We need more, we need better and coordinated research to be able to make an appropriate risk assessment. I would like to get back to the young people, and I think that this is very important. Because we must break the narrative of young people as drivers of conflict, especially in cities and suburban areas. Instead, we should look upon young people as problem solvers, as actors, and we should include and make full use of their potentials as efficient peace builders in their areas. Young people's participation and leadership is crucial in promoting a culture of peace, inclusion, and dialogue that prevents exclusion and violence. And this is the way also that we create hope for change. Earlier this week, UNDP's Africa office had visited Stockholm to launch a report on the journey to extremism in Africa. We need to understand the forces that attract young people to radicalization and to violent extremism and bring them into part of the solution, listening to their solutions. At the same time, inclusive cities and peace processes are created through interaction and dialogue between people. In November 2016, the Swedish Institute Alexandria and Fryshuset, which is a place where young people in Stockholm can gather, they jointly arranged a future forum, gathering young people from different backgrounds in finding solutions for peace building, conflict prevention, social cohesion, and social transformation. Participants in the youth forum came from Sweden as well, from the Middle East and from North Africa. Today's conflicts are not isolated. Indeed, some of the issues at the core of violent conflict in other parts of the world are also reflected in the daily lives of young people in neighborhoods outside Stockholm. The Future Forum reflected this reality and provided a space for bringing forward the commitments from the Security Council Resolution 2250, which is about inclusion of young people. In this way, the forum served as a starting point for the work that will be carried out in Sweden, but also through our international development cooperation. In conclusion, I'm very proud to see all these internationally renowned experts, but also colleagues from here in Stockholm and Sweden. And I'm looking forward to listen in to the important work that we have ahead of us. And I wish you all successful deliberations in the plenaries and in the impressive number of breakouts sessions that you will have during this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. I'm very grateful that you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, which are absolutely crucial. And these goals are not only related to development, they are also related to peace and security and to human rights and democratic institutions. The formula for the whole agenda of the UN, in fact, is there is no peace without development, there is no development without peace, and none of the above without respect of human rights. And the fact that these goals cover both development and reach into security and to human rights is, I think, a very important step forward. So thank you very much for adding that element to our discussions. Now we turn to the cities. There are many prominent representatives in the room from cities. At this table here in front of me is Ahmed Abu Taleb, the Mayor of Rotterdam, which has much to talk about. But the person to welcome from the side of Sweden is, of course, the Mayor of Stockholm. Karin Vangård, please enter the stage.
Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Stockholm, my beautiful hometown, the city located on 14 islands between Lake Mälaren and the Baltic Sea, the fastest growing city in Europe. It's impossible to forget what happened on April the 7th this year, when a stolen truck was used as a deadly weapon in a terrorist attack. It was meant to frighten Stockholmers and people in the Western world. Innocent people were brutally murdered, an attempt to silence our open society and plant a seed of fear amongst us. A tragedy for those who lost a friend, a family member, and for the whole society. Stockholmers stick together. I am proud of how Stockholm and the Stockholmers replied to this horrific attack, showing solidarity, helping each other to find shelters, to get home, to giving each other lift and support. The staff at preschool stayed when parents were not able to pick up their child. The management of the city worked day and night. And the police department, the fire department, the employees in our hospitals are our heroes. It was a city determined to stay open for all. Nothing can change our belief in what we can achieve together. After the attack, Stockholmers showed how strong we are when we join forces. Thanks to an initiative from committed Stockholmers, a love manifestation was organized by the city. Thousands of Stockholmers gathered to express their disgust on violence and the love of our city and the unity that makes our city fantastic. Cities today are not only places where people live and work. There are melting spots, ideas, challenging, and development, every major city is a reflection of the global arena. And the issue of secure cities is an issue of global safety. And while we see the world and our cities changing through globalization, we also see this leading to polarization and in sometimes radicalization and extremism. We have to look at this at face value. Radicalization amongst fundamentalists, both right and left-wing extremists, is creating an environment in our cities where people feel unsafe and unprotected. We can clearly see neighborhoods where unemployment and disenfranchisement prevails. It is being in risk of losing the battle to organized crime, drug trade, and extreme political movements. The answer we in the democratic world gives to this must be twofold. One, we have to give our police the mandate to strike down on crime and terrorism. Two, we have to deliver a way out, a direction towards inclusion in our policies. We are not entitled to abandon our citizens in either respect. As Mayor of Stockholm, one of my main goals is to achieve a socially and ecologically sustainable city where both people and economy are growing. And at that time, when the city is growing really fast, we need to go on safeguarding our water supply. The water is really, really important when we talk about how we will have the world. We will continue to invest in resilient water solutions. It will be possible to dramatically reduce the current high risk of flooding and protect key infrastructure and drinking water. Connection and have the ability to drink fresh water every day should be a human right. Stockholm needs to address a number of challenges in order to hold our position as an attractive, safe, and secure and resilient city. First, focus on reducing accidents and fires that cost lives and property. City planning should be done to minimize risks. Second, focus on crime prevention, giving young people a chance to step out from the criminal life and work against criminal groups and extremism. This work contains an individual perspective as well as measurements within the city's administration. And third, not least, focus on prevention of unlawful influence on public servants. Employees must be protected from threats, harassments, and violence. Now, all this is not done in a flip of coin. It takes effort. It takes courage. It takes cooperation and access to knowledge. Given that, I am more than glad to welcome you to this conference that will give us knowledge, cooperation, and a network of people around the globe striving for secure cities. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Karin, for this welcome from Stockholm. and also that you so strongly underline the importance of water. In the global perspective, one of the greatest challenges is now whether scarcity of water will lead to conflict or whether it will lead to cooperation. I think all of you in this audience should think of the second way. How do we make it a factor of peace and conciliation and cooperation rather than a factor of conflict? It's a crucial issue. And of course, for the cities, it's a great challenge of infrastructure, particularly in the developing world, which I've seen so much of. So thank you, Karin, for adding that perspective. Now we will move closer to the theme of the conference. And I will therefore ask Ambassador Mikael Salin, conference coordinator, former colleague of mine, having been ambassador to Oslo, Turkey, and a number of places, plus also helped us in the UN work with the issues related to Sudan. Mikael, you are welcome to enter the stage to present the conference theme here.
Thank you, Jan. Dan Smith said yesterday that you are the only person that he can call his boss. I have called you my boss many, many times through a long career. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say first that with your permission, Jan, I'm going to say that for me it's amazing when I compare with what I thought back in March about this conference and where we are now. It's quite a journey, an interesting one indeed. I was considering how to present this conference, and then I felt that I should make it as a musical metaphor, like a Sinfonietta by Vivaldi or something I say. I'm looking at Mr. Grandi, with some themes and then some variations. The logic of the conference, as you have seen, as we've heard, is one where focus, compared to last year, now is more tilting towards the real challenges as they are. Be it war and conflict, be it climate change, be it mass migration, be it refugee situation, etc. And then, of course, the impact of those on cities, etc. So we felt, and you can read some interviews with Dan Smith about this in some recent publications, that we should create a conference which has this logic of going first into the challenges as they are, and then take a deliberate step. And that is in comparison with last year's conference, the first one, on which there is a report, by the way, in your folders that you can read, written by Ian Anthony, who is somewhere here. And then, of course, it follows up with, so what does it mean for cities? And then, so what are the designs to respond? I think it's a fascinating rhythm into it. And then if we make it into a musical metaphor, we say that these are the themes. And then come the variations in 3 different stages with 4 different breakout sessions. The organization as such will impose on royalties and others here present a terrible choice between those breakout sessions. You can't be, no matter how split the personality you are, you can't visit them all. Some of us will nonetheless try to gather so that we can report in turn, so that there can be a follow-up to this conference. Themes for those breakout sessions have been chosen to be seeking a balance between the various aspects of strains and geographical examples. We have examples from cities like Rotterdam, Stockholm, as we heard, others. We have also aspects of different kinds of strains represented in those. I'm not going into the various, they are 12 altogether. So you're going to be having to make a choice. My first plenary, not plenary, session will be about the Middle East. That is a follow-up to last night's event, which I think was very, very interesting. And then there are several others. So pick your choice. There can be some kind of logic to choosing some kind of one particular session for the various stages. But if you need my advice on what to pick, well, look me up. I'll be here, together with a wonderful team, by the way, from SIPRI, making this conference possible, if I may say so, even now. So we are very pleased to have you all, and I would say finally, Jan, to the panelists here, that this is a fantastic audience. We know this from knowing internationally, there's a high international representation here, both among speakers in the various sessions and also in the audience. And then, of course, a high level of expertise. So all the speakers, I think, are going to feel an enormous response from the audiences. Welcome to the conference.
Thank you, Mikael. Thank you, Mikael. You provided a very impressive overture to this SIPRI opera. And we will now enter the first act. And I will ask the SIPRI director, my dear friend, and my favorite moderator, by the way, and now he has to prove it, to introduce the first panel discussion together with a very prominent group of panelists. But over to you, Dan.
You can see, Jan, from the way I sprinted up the stairs that I am eager to get on with the discussion and the work. I think we've had a wonderful introduction, and now we go into really exploring these topics. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Mr. Speaker, Madam Mayor, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our first topic for this first plenary falls under the heading of global security challenges. The way I see things when I'm looking at the apparently growing risks of instability and armed conflict in the world today, I look basically at four strands, four themes, four trends that worry me. One has been referred to a lot, is climate change. And the impact of that, you don't know with one hurricane or another, is this actually a result of climate change? But that's what the headlines are saying this week. There are 4 times as many extreme weather events now as there were some half century ago. That's a trend. If you don't see the trend, your eyes are not open. But combining with that then, part of the impact of that is on the competition for natural resources. Is that competition in different places in the world increasing? Not just the natural resources that can be mined from the ground, but the natural resources of the water and therefore soil quality. And in other places, because of pollution, the natural resource of the air that we breathe. The third element that exacerbates that as well is that we do not live in an equal world where everybody has the same chance to be solving these problems. Inequalities are growing worldwide, and that also has to be factored in. And in this period, this time when we could be doing with more cooperation to be facing and handling worsening problems, the short-term trend seems to be that the prospects of cooperation are weakening with the return of geopolitical rivalries. So shifts in the world balance of power and the distribution of power worldwide are also a part of this picture. We have a panel, a wonderful panel, to try to make sense of this. There will be a keynote, and then we will sit and we will discuss. And I hope it'll be possible then to open up and to engage you in asking questions and making comments. So first of all, can I invite the panelists to join me up here on the stage and take your seats. Filippo Grandi, who is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Ulrika Modir, the the State Secretary for International Development, whom we met earlier. And Silvia Franciscone, who is the head of the Rome office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. So please take your seats.
Hi.
And then, without further ado, then Filippo, I invite you to take the rostrum for the keynote speech.
Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, and all guests, thank you very much for having me back here. I was part of a panel last year, so I'm very grateful to SIPRI for inviting me again. On that panel, I was sitting with Jan Eliasson, who was then one of my bosses as Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. And therefore, I'd like to thank him in his new capacity for having me here in this important forum. Ambassador Salin spoke about variations. Now, I will share a few thoughts from a very specific variation on the theme, which is that of forced displacement and refugees. But I hope that from my reflections on this theme, you can all draw thoughts and conclusions that would be useful to the larger debate and very important debate of this conference around cities and around security. So let me focus on the dynamics of forced displacement and a few thoughts on how we can address that, and we'll take it from there. First of all, maybe some facts. We at UNHCR have a way of counting the people who we consider, the way we say it, of our concern. People that, as we also say, are in need of international protection. This is essentially refugees, internally displaced people, and people without nationality, stateless people. If you add up all these people, you get probably close to 75, 80 million. If you take out the stateless, and that's the figure we usually utilize, is 65, 66 million people. So a fairly large country in terms of size. And so many perceptions are generated by this phenomenon today because of the politicization to which it is subjected. So many simplistic perceptions for a phenomenon, that of forced displacement, that has in reality extremely complex causes. And one thing that we should not forget, we focus here, you will focus in this conference on security, very much from the perspective of the security of cities here in Europe, in the industrialized north. Let's not forget, much as most of the refugees and displaced are not in the rich world, most of the insecurity from which they flee is also not in the industrialized north. Jan spoke earlier, I can't remember if today or yesterday, but he mentioned destroyed cities. I was in Aleppo just a few months ago, and I can tell you this is a city I've known for many years during my time in the Middle East, a thriving city. And it's no wonder that so many of the refugees from Syria are coming from those completely wounded, completely devastated and destroyed cities. So insecurity is a much more global issue that has to be seen from that perspective. But also, of course, increasingly people move for a variety of reasons. I was recently, a few days ago, literally, in Central America, where thousands of people are fleeing because of gang violence, because of violence by gangs that operate like rogue states, occupying territory, raping women, forcibly recruiting children. And of course, in addition to that, you have climate change, as Ulrika mentioned earlier, and you have economic factors, and flows are becoming more and more complex to address. Conflict, war continue to be one of the main drivers. I said yesterday in Parliament, and I said it many times before, that, and Jan knows this very well from his previous job, we have become part of a world, we are in a world in which making peace has become almost impossible. The multipolar world in which we live doesn't seem to have developed the same tools for addressing conflict and war that the bipolar world of a few decades ago had, amidst many difficulties, been able to put in place, especially in those very important years after World War II. Those mechanisms have broken down, and we have not been able to put in place new mechanisms to address conflict. Hence, conflicts that last for decades, Afghanistan, Somalia. Hence, conflicts that recur, like in the Great Lakes region of Africa or Burundi and Congo. Hence, conflicts that are more and more proxy conflicts with the involvement of foreign powers, like in Syria, like in Libya, for example. All these conflicts produce in large and larger numbers many displaced people and many refugees. All these conflicts are theaters of very serious violations of international humanitarian law, and civilians are particularly targeted by the very nature of these conflicts. Hence the very large figures that I have spoken earlier about. Now, the other reflection I want to share with you is that in spite of these large numbers, it is actually very difficult for people to flee. This is not something that we often think about. 2/3 of the refugee figure that I gave earlier are in fact, more than 40 million are in fact internally displaced people. Sometimes by choice, but most of the time because there is no other choice. Think of Syria. The borders of Syria are impenetrable by now. People cannot get out of Syria. The neighboring countries who already host more than 5 million Syrians have said enough is enough and have closed borders. And after Europe put an end through various means to the flow of Syrians into Europe, that closure became even greater. So people in many situations are trapped near the wars. And like I said, we should not forget that most refugees are not in the rich world, but are in poor or middle-income country. We estimate that about 86% are in the global south and not in the global north. And support to countries hosting large numbers of refugees, think of Ethiopia, think of Jordan, think of Pakistan, think increasingly of some countries in Latin America. Support to those countries has been insufficient. There's been a lot of support, but has been insufficient, and more importantly, given the protracted nature of displacement, that type of support, which has been traditionally humanitarian, has not been able to address the problem of large numbers of refugees in poor and middle-income countries living for a long time. The type of support in those situations should go beyond the humanitarian. A reflection around that has started in the last couple of years, but we need to pursue that course of thought and of action if really we want to address this problem of imbalance in taking responsibility for refugees. A lot on the global south and less on the global north. In fact, the global north is not giving a good example. There are exceptions, like Sweden, for sure, like Germany. But in general, what we observe in the global north, and by the global north I do not mean just Europe, but also North America, also Australia, what we observe is increasingly restrictive policies. I'm coming from Hungary. I was in Hungary yesterday. I stood, actually, there's no seat. I stood at what is called the green border. That's the border of Europe between Hungary and Serbia. I stood below 2 or 3 meters of barbed wire with people on the other side. 5 of them are allowed into Hungary per day. 5 of them. So Europe, this is the message that Europe is sending to the world. Less than 1% of the refugees worldwide benefit from resettlement program. Again, and I don't want to say it because Your Majesty, you're here, but Sweden is an example from that point of view. Next year, Sweden will offer 5,000 places for resettlement. This is a very high figure given the population of this country and given that you also receive people directly. But this is the way to go, and this should be an example for other countries. And we are promoting this right now for the central Mediterranean situation and the countries upstream. And look at the relocation of refugees from countries within Europe, from Greece and Italy. This is a program that was launched 2 years ago and that has not been successful. And increasingly, the global north, the discourse in the global north is, let's externalize. Let's build camps, that's what we hear, outside Europe, from which we can then select the people that will come here. This is the type of message that we are sending to countries that are hosting millions of refugees. So we argue that this approach is short-sighted. We argue, like it is very clearly stated in the preamble of the 1951 Refugee Convention, a convention that, by the way, just to be very clear, we consider very, very, very relevant still today. We argue that refugee protection, the protection of refugees, is a shared international responsibility. We argue also that it is right to extend protection to refugees, but at the same time that it is also effective to do so. Clearly, refugee flows are part of a bigger phenomenon, as I said earlier. And this is why, and we discussed this briefly last night in the Parliament, this is why it is important to concentrate, to focus, to support the process that started in New York last year. Jan Eliasson was one of the architects of the summit that took place at the General Assembly last year in New York on refugees and migrants. The conclusion of that very important summit was that within 2 years, so by next year, 2 compacts meaning 2 international agreements, would be established. One on refugees and one, and this is very important, on safe and orderly migration. And the 2 compacts are distinct, should remain distinct, but have very important interrelations that need to be taken into account. Few words on this. Why a compact? Why international cooperation? Well, I think that first and foremost because the compact, if it is successful, and we're working towards that, will be a very important opportunity to reaffirm principles of international protection, refugees as international responsibility. But in a context of a broader framework in which more actors than is presently the case are involved to strengthen the responses that we give to refugee crisis. This is key because the traditional responses have become inadequate in the new realities. And this means that responses have to be at different levels in host countries, supporting the inclusion of refugees. Inclusion is a word that we have heard a lot in the introductory remarks. Inclusion is also key to the future of refugee responses. Finish camps and separate services and separate tracks. The important thing, the important direction that we have to follow is to ensure that where refugees are in large numbers, the structures of that country, the schools, the hospitals, the economy are supported so that refugees can benefit until a solution is found to their plight that can benefit from inclusion. It is important to strengthen resettlement and other pathways, legal, orderly pathways for people to move on if people need that. It is important to strengthen transit countries in a world in which mobility has become so easy. It's not just the first countries of asylum, but countries on the way further afield, that further on, that need to be strengthened, as we see very much in the central Mediterranean situation. And of course, I think it will be important through the compact that countries rich countries, countries in the global north, reaffirm that their asylum system are strong, are open, and are effective. The compact will be an opportunity, as I said, to broaden the range of actors that are involved in responses. Not just humanitarian actors, but other actors as well. I am very happy that we at UNHCR, for example, are currently programming considerable resources, up to $2 billion, for about 10 large refugee hosting countries together with the World Bank. This is new. This is a new approach. But this is all part of this approach to strengthen inclusion and long-term intervention to respond to refugee crisis. Blankets, medicines, food, all this will remain extremely important. Humanitarian action, don't get me wrong, will continue to be one core response, but it has to be from the beginning inscribed in a broader perspective that looks at the resilience of refugees and of the communities, often the cities that are hosting them. And for that, we need to give an important role to development actors like international financial institutions, like bilateral cooperation. And then a third important element, it is important through the compact to promote the involvement of what we call the whole of society. If refugees are international responsibility, they're not just the responsibilities of government and international organizations like the United Nations, but also of the people. They're a global phenomenon that we can all see in our cities here. Hence the importance of this response. Hence the importance, and we're already getting a good response there, of the private sector, of the business community. Hence the key role that can be played by cities and by mayors, not only in your cities, but also as a support to cities from which refugees come. I had a fantastic dialogue with the mayor of Madrid very recently on that. Not only she is making available places for asylum and integration of people, but she says, I want to bring our expertise and our resources to cities in places like Turkey or Ethiopia, where we can help make a difference. Let me conclude by saying a last note. This conference is a conference on security. Often, sadly, refugees and migrants are associated with insecurity. Often this is done for political purposes, because of course, like I say all the time, these are people that flee from different forms of insecurity. They don't want to bring insecurity here. It's quite the opposite. However, it is also true that unmanaged, anarchic movements, disorderly responses can bring many elements of social and economic insecurity, can bring actually insecurity to places where they happen. Unmanaged flows are extremely destabilizing and can be especially destabilizing for large cities where most refugees move to. This is why it is important to have a comprehensive approach. This is why, like Jan said about water, we need to look at these global phenomena as opportunities for cooperation rather than occasions of further conflict and division. That's why principled and comprehensive solutions are the response to the threats, hypothetical or real, that these movements can represent. This is why this comprehensive and principled solution can contribute in large parts of the world to stabilize situations. That's why through the legal, orderly pathways, more resettlement and so forth, we can create competition with smugglers and traffickers that in many parts of the world are a deep factors of insecurity. And this is why a better management of flows is so important, including in Europe. And certainly, last but not least, this is why, through this approach, investing more in integration, we can avoid the exclusion of large number of refugees and migrants that are very fertile pool for insecurity and even terrorism at a later stage. I would like you to keep all this in mind as you discuss threats and responses in cities and in our contemporary world. Please remember that having, hopefully next year, effective compacts on refugees and on migrants will also reinforce security and will, more importantly, even perhaps free up the full potential of refugees and migrants to contribute to the societies hosting them. Many thanks.
Filippo, thank you so much for that. A broad, passionate, full of concern, full also of strategic thinking and of practicalities and ways forward. The idea of a keynote is that, in a sense, it guides discussion. So what I'm going to do now is to pick a point or two out of what you were saying and ask our two other panelists for some commentary, and then, and then come back to you for your further thoughts about that. I thought early on in your talk, one of the interesting points you made, which I immediately started making notes on, was your contrast between the world that we live in now and the world of before the end of the Cold War, the multipolar world compared to the bipolar world. And the suggestion that you made was that we're lacking peace instruments now, or peacemaking instruments, compared to that period. Now, I think I just want to pick a line from my boss, from Jan. Since everybody's quoting him one way or another, why shouldn't I be allowed to as well? And make sure that he can't say this later on in the conference, because now I've stolen it from him. But he did say it last night, that he is an optimist, but he is becoming a worried optimist. Okay? And I think, if you look at patterns of armed conflict from 1990 to 2010, there's fewer armed conflicts. The number each year is declining. In the last 5-6 years, the number has increased. So there are grounds for thinking that the world is more dangerous now. I mean, the evidence is there to give you some pause for thought. But let's think a little bit more about whether we are now lacking peace capacities that we once had. So, Sylvia, your thoughts on that?
Right, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here, for the warm welcome, and also the welcome from the Mayor of Stockholm and your very inspiring speech before. I do believe, yes, it's a different world. We always say that, no doubt, and we have moved very quickly from a bipolar world to a multipolar world. I do think, I don't want to give up hope in this regard, and I do think we should not be afraid of a multipolar world. Actually, it is definitely an age of uncertainty, but it is a challenge, and I think it is also an opportunity to build what we lack today, and is trust and understanding each other. I do think that one of the reasons why we are living in an insecure world is because we feel insecure, and is the lack of trust. Lack of trust that goes citizens towards governments, governments and governments, not to mention governments, even partners in the European Union, for example. We don't trust each other anymore. And of course, Europe is not the project we have dreamt of when we started this project. And of course, also of governments towards the international institutions, we have to say that. What options do we have? First of all is the capacity to, as I said before, to understand each other, the capacity to predict what happens, because I think one of the biggest problems we had is that we were unable to predict things. for example, the Arab revolutions. Only people who were on the ground were able, they warned us that something was happening. We didn't know when precisely, but there were some movements. But we, and when I say we, I'm meaning also think tanks like us, from the European Council on Foreign Relations and many other think tanks, because we tend to speak among each other, among ourselves, we don't have really the full knowledge on the ground, but also, yes, this non-understanding which prevent us to understand the phenomenon, the scenarios, and therefore to manage the issues. And when you cannot manage issues, then you build fears among the population, and the circle goes on and on. And I think that we have to start to be able to predict what is going to happen. In Europe, we haven't been able to predict, for example, not only the Arab Revolution, but also the Brexit. I was taken by surprise, totally by surprise, and most probably Brexit happened because of the migration. So everything is very much intertwined. And also the elections of President Trump. And this takes me back to your question, the bipolar versus multipolar world. Are we sure that we will be in a safer world with that bipolar world, with this head of states? I'm not sure about. To be honest, the 2030 agenda was mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals were mentioned, and it's such an important framework. I have, in another hat I'm working for the Prime Minister office in Italy, dealing with G7 issues. And we had problems with our US partners in having the Agenda 2030 that should be an acquis included in the final documents, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals, not to mention climate change, which was, of course, a failure, not only in Taormina, but also the G20 later on in Germany, not to mention the difficulties we are facing towards Iran, and one of the greatest achievements that we have reached in the last years was precisely the agreement on the nuclear deal, and the whole multilateralism, I think, is at threat. So basically, I do think we have to face the reality. We are a multipolar world. We have to get rid of our preconceptions we had in the past. We had to dialogue with Russia. There's no doubt about that. We have to deal with Assad, no doubt about that. I think in this regard, we made some mistakes in the past. We have to get rid of Assad straight away. That, in my view, was a mistake. I mean, Assad, of course, everybody wants Assad to go away. We want to phase out, but no doubt that it had to be part of the negotiations. So let's face it, it's there are challenges, and another one is climate change. What we would do without China on climate change. 2015 was a tremendous year for climate change, not only because of Paris. Of course, Paris is one of the most wonderful things that happened, but also because it's the year when the new installation of plants for renewable energies overtook new installation for fossil fuels. And more than 200 billion euros were invested in this regard, mainly from China, obviously. But I have to say that this takes us to think that we have, of course, to get over the challenge of climate change, necessarily together with China. So this is something, I would say, also exciting somehow.
Okay, so there are a lot of challenges. The multipolar world is a reality. We need to be facing those challenges with open eyes. That's part of what the task of an institute like this and of a conference like this is. I want to ask you, Ulrika, about what might be thought of as being two trends. Just go back to this idea that the world is in a more difficult situation now, and there are greater challenges in dealing with those problems. But one of the things that you commented on in your speech this morning was a growing importance and a growing understanding of the importance of prevention as a policy. So do you see sort of genuine mileage in that as we move forward, that there is real progress being made on this at an international level on prevention?
Well, I think, of course, it's a multipolar world, but it's also a world of many contradictions. So at the same time as we're a bit scared about development in different ways, we can also see that we actually also build decisions on knowledge. And I think, once again, going back to the Agenda 2030 on sustainable development and the Paris Agreement, they were both decisions made within the multilateral forum not so many years ago based on knowledge. And they are there, and they are frameworks and also binding decisions that we should really work on. And I think that we also, I mean, talking about trends going in different directions, I think we also need to see that there are a lot of possibilities to work still within the multilateral. We need to use the multilateral arena to work with, but also that we can create, and I think that this fora will be an example of that, many different and new arenas to work with, cities to cities, bringing good examples on how to turn problems into solutions, but also regions to regions. And I mean, Sweden also as a country has the possibility to sign agreements with California when the new administration in the US is not interested working on climate change. There are so many actors, and this, of course, is what we've seen. So there are so many possibilities at the same time, and I think we need to identify them and make good use of them.
So do you think the prevention agenda is moving forward, or have you felt since, I mean, let's be blunt about this, have you felt since the beginning of this year and the inauguration of a new US president that prevention agenda is perhaps beginning to stall?
Filippo was referring to that the discussion on the importance of working on prevention at the same time as we, of course, need to offer humanitarian support has been there for a while. I would say it has been there for a long, long time. I mean, several decades, people working on that, and people living in these situations, they know that the response need to be there on a more long-term basis, and that we need to work on prevention. And I think that this is also an area where we have a lot of examples that are going on. I mean, it might be that at the political level the discussion is not there, but among the institutions, among the UN agencies, and as we have seen also in cooperation with other entities such as the World Bank, things are moving forward. And Sweden is also very much part of this, looking for new solutions. We have a Syria crisis strategy where we work with humanitarian support on the one hand side, but at the same time trying to find ways of supporting actors at the local level in Syria, but also the neighboring countries on more long term. And of course, this is in the middle of the crisis, but this is the way we need to work on more prevention, but also on more long-term intervention in areas of conflict. So I think that this is also an example where, well, we might say that it's not at the core of the discussions among the main political leaders, but things are happening, and we need to build on those good examples and bring them forward and showcase that this is the way it works.
And maybe pay more attention to something which is also one of the driving ideas of this conference, that, as you said, there's a multiplicity of actors. So the headlines may be paying attention to what a very small proportion of the actors are actually doing. I mean, do you feel that, Filippo, in your work? Do you sense that this kind of, I mean, Ulrika is kind of pointing us towards an active undergrowth that we should be bringing. If we want to understand things better, we should be bringing it more into the limelight. But it's active, it's moving, it's changing things. Is this how you see things?
I think I would agree that that reflection has been there for a long time. I think that there was, like I said last night, there was an important trigger around the Syria situation. The Syria situation had many important characteristics. It was huge, very visible, very close to Europe, And at some point, it became, it spilled into Europe. You know, it's very interesting that the turning point in terms of responses to this global phenomenon, forced displacement, I'm not talking about the others, this one, the one I deal with, the shift to a different type of response, much more focusing on resilience, much more focusing on inclusion, on strengthening host countries, and eventually on prevention. Clearly, the two things are connected. That turning point was represented by Syrians arriving in Europe in large numbers. They somehow made that debate real for everybody. Their presence in Europe carried a very important message, not only that there was a terrible war that had to be resolved. That's why Stefan de Mistura is not here, because he's still trying to work on that political track, which remains very important. But I think they also brought another message, that unless we respond in a different way, longer term, looking at prevention, with today's possibility of human mobility, people will just move on. That's and the London conference, I keep going back to that. The conference that was held in London last year, the language, the substance, the content, and the concrete results that it starts having was really the signal that there was awareness, collective awareness. But let me stress again, first of all, this can only be achieved if there is international cooperation. When we deal with global phenomena, we cannot anymore do national responses. We have to really work together. This is, we have to convince politicians, let me be frank, and institutions like yours can help us do that, that international cooperation is not a weakness, but it is a strength. Because the language from many politicians goes exactly in the opposite direction. We need to do it ourselves because others will not play in support of our interest. So this type of responses, I think the undergrowth is there. It's beyond undergrowth. It's already happening in many places, but we need to make it the norm, and for that, we need to have more trust in international cooperation. We need to explain better to those who vote that international cooperation is important.
And I think, you used a word which Sylvia also used earlier, trust, which I think is going to keep on re-emerging as a theme. If you don't have a relationship of trust between people, communities, leaderships, authorities, it's not going to work in the end, however good the instruments are technically. There's another issue I want to come to you on, Filippo, and then come back in this direction or along the panel. But a thought has occurred to me, and conference organizers can complain to me afterwards about having this thought right now. I want to involve members of the audience in the possibility of asking questions, and I realize I didn't check out about roving mics and so on beforehand. So if somebody can make sure that that's looked after, then in about 10 minutes or so, we're going to start asking people for questions. And of course, if there's no roving mic, then it'll be the law of the jungle. The loudest shout will win. But before we decline to that level, I want to pick up there on part of what you were saying, and it was a thought which occurred to me during your talk. It seems to me that the politics of caring is becoming more and more important. Of caring for refugees, of caring for the cities, the communities which need to or are called upon to host the refugees, of caring for individuals' human rights as well as and freedoms as well as their security. You mentioned Brexit, Sylvia, and I just immediately think of that, what I think was an awful poster that warned British people that there were queues, endless queues of people waiting to flood into the UK. And I felt at that point, this is losing in the arguments about the politics of caring. Right? And then there have been other things, even in the UK and elsewhere, but also in Sweden, where you feel the tide moving back again and care becomes stronger and more explicit. How do you feel this is going, and how do you relate these, what would for most people be quite abstract things, the compacts, that I agree are absolutely fundamental, but for most people they're rather distant. How do you relate that to these issues of care for strangers, which is what some of our values are really about?
I relate it very much. I mean, I assume this audience understands the real concrete importance of those processes like compacts. So I didn't develop the other part of the argument, which, however, I mentioned. The compacts will also be an opportunity to reaffirm that helping people in distress is not just useful for stability, for orderly management of refugee flows, etc., all the things that I've spoken about that will be spoken about here. But it is also right, because people in distress deserve solidarity and compassion. This is the other side of the argument, which I think we must not lose sight of. This is why, whilst we need to look longer term at development, at resilience, at protection, this is why we also need to preserve the independence, effectiveness, rapidity of humanitarian action, because that's what is immediately needed by people in distress. Look, I just close by saying, look at what's happening now. The most acute problem that my organization and others are facing today is the influx of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar into Bangladesh. And clearly, the response there has to be two-tier. Clearly, we need to look at the long term. This is like the 4th or 5th time that we have a crisis. So clearly, the root causes have not been addressed. And the root cause, we all know, are two, essentially. One is the lack of citizenship for the Rohingya refugees, and second is the extreme poverty of the area from which they come, which affects not only the Rohingya, but also the Rakhine community, the Buddhist community. So these are the two long-term directions in which we have to move in responding. But right now, as we speak, people that have suffered unimaginable violence and deprivation are coming over into Bangladesh, and they need blankets, they need recognition, they need relief. That is the solidarity that is still needed. And I think that we need to remind, and I conclude, to remind everybody that solidarity is needed by people arriving in Bangladesh, but solidarity is also needed here for people arriving in our continent, in Europe. And this is what I tried to convey 2 days ago in Hungary. I understand the complexity of the situation, but there are people in extreme distress for which the first and foremost necessity is a gesture of solidarity.
And I would accept that, and I think most people would accept that. And then you hit the element of fear. Fear of the other, fear of the stranger. Ulrike, you're a politician in an environment where this issue has been important. How do you address this balance between the need for solidarity with those who are in deep distress that some of us find unimaginable on the one hand, and on the other, the fears of ordinary people? They're not bad, it's human. It's many people can feel it, and many people can feel both the emotions at the same time, because, as you said, just like the world is full of contradictions, also people are full of contradictions. So in the political arena, how do you try to address these?
I think it's also not a new discussion, but it's a new scene perhaps that we can also see, like we saw in the city center of Stockholm, where we had have a group of young Afghans who are seeking asylum, and you actually have people there standing in solidarity with them, and then you have people shouting at them, telling them to go away and to leave our country, and this is something that we have not seen before. Even though, as you say, people being afraid of what's new and what's strange and what will happen and how this relates to their own future, has always been part of any development in any country, and it's not so different, people living in Jordan or people living in Sweden, perhaps.
But then I believe that it is very, very important to build on the good examples and the change makers that are there. And as I said also in my initial speak, to find ways of dialogue and bringing people together, not least the young generation, as I also brought forward. I think this is essential. And I think that also our major from Stockholm, I mean, she gave the example that people actually also do bring compacts, as they did when we had the terrorist attack in Stockholm. And I think that this is a very good example of where people in Stockholm showcase through social media that, I mean, we recreate the social contract in our city, and we're finding solutions, immediate solutions to this problem that we had. And I think that we can do this in many different ways also in relation to asylum seekers and refugees, and at the time when people are there with the possibility to stay in our country and integrate, we also need to bring the good examples forward. And I think we have good examples in Sweden, and we have good examples internationally through our broad international development cooperation. And you used to say that when we meet as well, even though they might seem as tiny solutions to huge problems, I think that they are important. And bring different voices from different parts of society, to bring the private sector in and to tell about their examples of integration, to bring the academia in and talk about history and what have we learned. I met an economist in Jordan, also telling about, I mean, the relation between economic growth in relation to their responsibility and how migrants and refugees have come to their country. So, well, we need to bring different voices in, not only from politics.
Filippo mentioned resilience of refugees during his keynote address, resilience of communities. And I think that, I mean, most studies of resilience are going to tell you that precisely resilience is constructed, built and protected through a myriad of small actions and not just through one big initiative. But Sylvia, if I come to you now, can I ask you about how you think this is working or not working, as the case may be, at the EU level?
I'm not so positive at governmental level and EU level, to be honest. When you said there is a multiplicity of actors and you mentioned the politics of caring, I think we are very far from that at the governmental level. I have to be honest in this regard. Even this shift in policy of my own country, Italy, is really worrying me. And
this is the shift in policy on the
on migration, on migration. Let me say that I do see the politics of caring much more at the local level, at the city level. You have a mayor speaking about open society. In Barcelona, people marched. The mayor of Milan said, we want to emulate Barcelona. We want to have a march ourselves. That was a very difficult one. He was brave to do that because, if you organize a march in favor of migrants and not against something, you really risk a lot. I mean, a flop. And it happened. And I do see this more and more at the local level, at the domestic level. Having the Mayor of London, for example, the reaction, it's really inspiring and triggers other actions, other small actions that make big actions. But I don't see this at the government level. Migration has been an existential crisis for Europe and still is. Has separated us from east to west Europe and from north to south. We have totally different perceptions of what the risks are. And I have to say that Italy has asked for many months, even the previous government, more solidarity in Europe, and it was pretty much frustrated by the reaction. And today we have, even Italy has a strong man in the government using, the fist perhaps. But the reason why I'm not so positive is that the fist is not accompanied with credible migration policy. I mean, if you want to be hard on something, I can justify for moment some stricter rules as long as you present me like a proper policy of integration, removing the obstacles to integration, have a common idea of the legal channels, and have a positive narrative about even economic migrants, that I've never seen a proper plan on, not at the the domestic level, at the national level, and neither at the European level. I mean, Juncker mentioned this point, and in his speech the other day, he said there is also a positive dimension of migration. Now we have to see a proper plan of what we need, what is going to be good for our society, for our aging Europe. And that can change a lot. And then in terms of multiple actor, and I finished here, there is a role for everybody. A role definitely for mayors, a role for NGOs, activists, but also for journalists, to be honest. Because the narrative that has been created and the perception that, because we are in the age of the politics of perception, because then if you look at the numbers, I mean, you will see that perhaps there's no reason. And even from those government who you would never expect. Yesterday we were talking about we are becoming more and more cynical, and today we are accepting things that years ago we would have never accepted. So.
Okay, so that's a lot of rich material, and I've tried to go from the global to the local. I'm a 1970s person. I was told then, think global, act local, and I haven't quite grown out of that. But now let's try to bring in some people. There's a hand and there's even a microphone quite near it. So please tell us who you are and ask a question, make a comment.
Thank you. I am Erik Melander, Professor of Peace and Conflict Research, Uppsala University. So I think that we heard a lot about challenges the world is facing right now, and we all care about those challenges. That's why we are here. However, our responses must be based on a correct analysis. And I think we need to realize that the Cold War era was a much more violent and dangerous period than the post-Cold War era. And that is so important to realize because otherwise we risk downplaying the importance of the new tools for peacemaking that have developed since, in particular, since the end of the Cold War. Gender mainstreaming, all these new things that actually do contribute to a more peaceful world. So my point here is that perhaps it is not the lack of possibility of making peace that is the problem, because there are important peace processes going on in long-standing key conflicts, such as in the Philippines, in Colombia, but rather it is the misuse of military means, misguided, failed interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq that has created a lot of the problems that we are facing now. So I would like to ask you to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. Really good. One down here at the front. Mayor of Rotterdam, here comes the microphone.
Thank you so much. My name is Ahmed Abu Talib. It sounds an Arab name, but it's not. I'm born in Morocco. I'm a member of the so-called Amazigh minority. Have you heard of it? Yeah, some voices. We sometimes also call it Berber community. Who of you is listening to the Arab media? A few, some of them. Who is watching television from Iraq? The Hussein, Hassan television stations? Who is watching Al-Alam from Iran? Who is watching Al-Mayadeen from Lebanon? Who is watching the Hezbollah news media from Lebanon? Who is watching Al Jazeera in Arabic language? Who is listening to Al-Akhbar from Saudi Arabia? The common sense from all these stations, when they invite ordinary people into the studio, or the intellectuals, is two themes. They want to get rid of their own leaders because they are collaborating with the West, fleeing the money from the area to the bank accounts in Switzerland, in London and New York. They're abusing the national resources for personal things, going on holiday to Europe in Nice, spending 100 million euros for a couple of weeks of holiday. I quote one of the news media. They want to get rid of the West. So we are not partners there among these people, because indeed they don't trust us. We are collaborating with their leaders, that's the common opinion, to abuse the national resources because the West wants to have that money of oil in the West to be invested. That's a common opinion too. And then the Europeans and the West is selling weapons to the region to allow these people to kill each other. And then they are hypocrites, so they find us hypocrites because we act against Saddam Hussein, which they find a good thing, but then we cause a domestic war between the Shia and the Sunni. And we had the possibility to predict that. Everyone must know that if you eliminate Saddam Hussein, you create a domestic war. And then, in their own opinion, we are again hypocrites because we allow Israel to create an open-air prison in Gaza. They want to get rid of us, they want to get rid of their own leaders, and it's there the source of a tremendous conflict. So please, change your glasses. Watch this conflict from another angle. You see different things. You make another analysis. Maybe that's better fruitful, Filippo, to get another analysis for a sustainable solution. That's really what worries me. I'm with you. I need a word optimist. But who are not optimists, get out of your chair, because if you're not an optimist, you cannot help solve the problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then at the table right behind you, there's, yes.
Hi, my name is Sarah Williamson, and I'm the director of Protect the People, an international organization in Washington, D.C. And we focus on training the security sector in the protection of civilians. We spend a lot of our time trying to explain what protection is and what protection results are. How do we get to achieve protection? And I want to pick up on something that Dan said that is quite important, actually, that protection is not just one big initiative, but it's a myriad of small actions when put together that lead us to protection. So my question is for the High Commissioner, and in terms of thinking about this compact that UNHCR wishes to achieve with the states, is that the right way to go? We had a large meeting in New York last year where many states came together and made hundreds of commitments to refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. Many of those commitments, which are public for everyone to see, remain unfulfilled and are very important to the protection of vulnerable people. Can we think about protection in the way that Dan described it as a roadmap and not just a compact? How do we take states down the road? How do we lead them to the steps that result in meaningful, effective, and sustainable protection?
Thanks very much. So what I'm asking the panel to do now is to restrict themselves to 2 minutes each of comment on what has just been said and put to us. And there's a clock which I can see, but you can't. It ticks down cruelly. I hope that we will be able then to take another few questions and get some quick response from the panel before we break for coffee in about 15, 20 minutes. So Filippo, there was a question directly to you. Maybe you can give a quick thought to that.
Yeah, simply to say that, of course, a compact is a compact. A UN declaration is a UN declaration. We all know that. But believe me, if the compact is well articulated, as we hope it will be a new and important frame of reference in asking governments to perform certain things. So like all these things, you need to look at them in their practical value. By the way, last year, thanks to the United States, the New York Declaration, and you mentioned that, was accompanying. There was a twin meeting called by President Obama in which states were called to make concrete commitments. They did. You're quite right that many were not fulfilled. You know, maybe I am also a worried optimist. Many actually were fulfilled. I was recently in Ethiopia, just to give you an example. The government of Ethiopia is very serious about doing small things, and there I go to the roadmap and to the need to work with the communities, small things to make those commitments real. For example, to get people out of camps and in the communities, to allow refugees to have access to the university system. These are small things, but are so important to consolidate, to stabilize, to invest in prevention, and eventually in solutions. So I think that we need to look at this also from the positive side. Will a compact solve the problems the next day? Of course not. Will it create a framework within which it will be easier for people like us to call states to fulfill their responsibilities? Yes, it will be. We need to get there, though. We haven't got there yet.
Thanks a lot. That's 2 minutes. Ulrika, your 2 minutes.
New tools of peace building, new ways of working with our international development cooperation. I think that this is very important, and we have seen too that within our broad development cooperation, and Sweden is one of the biggest actors actually internationally, we need to work much more on conflict sensitivity, but also then prevention together with our efforts within foreign policy and diplomacy. So I think that we have built, and we would very much like to share that an example also within our Ministry for Foreign Affairs on really how to make good use of all the tools that can be there and build example both through diplomacy and peace-building efforts and also through the way we give support, and also the way, by the way, that we give support to actors like UNHCR. Sweden is one of the very few that give a more long-term predictable support and core support that makes it possible for these actors to do their job, to plan and to plan prevention, but also to act quickly when it's needed. And this is also a concern, talking about changes in the world, that donors don't act as responsibly as they have been in history. So that makes work more difficult for development cooperation. I think, I mean, what you see when you listen to or watch media from the Arab world is also what you hear when you watch media in the African continent. There's a lot of growing skepticism towards the West, and we need, as you say, listen into this and understand, and then create dialogue and continue. I mean, development cooperation and trade and so on, I mean, we have the tools and we need to believe in them and make use of the good examples. But I do agree fully. I mean, we can't bring any solutions to anything if we don't understand reality on the ground. It is of course, essential.
Okay.
Yeah, and I agree. A roadmap needs to have a lot of ideas, and we need to follow up also on the UN conferences. The Royal Highness, you were part of the Ocean Conference, and this was also an example where we brought a lot of commitments, and commitments are still coming in, and we need to find ways to follow up on those concrete examples to bring hope and action.
And Sylvia, your 2 minutes.
I still have hope for multilateralism, and I still think that this is a new tool, because for a while we have forgotten how multilateralism can be really powerful. The global compacts were mentioned with regard to migration. Again, no surprise, I'm a big fan of Paris Agreement, but we need to be also creative in designing these new tools. And I think Paris was very good also in terms of architecture. In the sense that we are also scared about the new US administration policy regarding climate change, but I do think Paris will survive even this administration, because it was thought to survive also a 4 years of difficulties. So basically it will survive. If we are going to change administration in the US in the future, it will survive also this stop, together with the multiple actor. Once again, you mentioned the relationship you have with California. One thing I'm worried about is trade. And I think we have given up altogether, Europe included, the vision of a multilateralism vis-à-vis trade. We are going bilateral, no doubt about that. Even Europe, Juncker mentioned the agreement with Canada, the ongoing agreement with Japan. We want to open up with Australia and others. I think the era of the WTO that only a few years ago was so powerful is almost over, and I do see this as a problem.
Great. Well, we still have time for 3 crisp comments and questions and 3 crisp responses. And there's one hand down there, one there, and I don't want to disenfranchise this side of the room just because my seat is angled over here. But if we start there, it'll come, don't worry. Again, tell us who you are.
Yeah.
Because I can't see.
My name is Dehshiri. I am Associate Professor of School of International Relations from Tehran, Iran. And I am writing a book on city diplomacy in Persian language. Therefore, I'm very happy to be here in this conference. Of course, I think that the importance of the structure of international system is very important to put emphasis on. We think in Iran that it is not multipolar nor unimultipolar, it is a transitional system, a system in transition that is marked by uncertainty and ambiguity and sort of paradox because of the globalization, which is marked by hypercomplexity and hyperconnectivity. But I think that the reason of insecurity is not the structure of international system. It is the process of international system. That means that previously it was a top-down approach, and nowadays bottom-up approach, and even we can say the dialectic of these 2 processes, but also the inclusive-exclusive approach that exists. That is also one of the cause. For example, for the Assad regime, at the beginning, some countries was saying that we do all the things to topple down Assad regime, and even we can indirectly help Daesh or ISIS for toppling down. Even for Hezbollah, who is an actor who is perceived as a stabilizer in Lebanon by some countries. Therefore, I want to say that it is important to change the vision and to look at gray and hybridic views and places.
Thanks very much. So you get the comments from the panel. There was a question down here. And this side of the room doesn't want the franchise at all, so there will be a 3rd one over there.
Hi, my name is Renata Avila. I'm from Guatemala, and so I'm very glad that you mentioned Central American humanitarian crisis, and also thank Sweden for the support to my country through the years. And my question is concretely about austerity. How austerity policies contribute to all of this that we are witnessing, and how without measures countering austerity, how can we overcome all of this? Because in my opinion, Brexit, many of the hostile migration policies are caused by austerity and by municipalities, local governments, and governments that they cannot face, they have no resources to deal with these crises.
Thank you very much. And there was a 3rd one at this table here. Mike's on its way.
Thank you very much. My name is Aidan White. I'm representing the Journalists Network. I wanted to, I noticed in the discussion this morning there were a lot of things said which I think touch on a single theme. We need to explain better. We need to discuss a relationship of trust. We need to look at elements of fear of the other, the need for solidarity, the questions that were raised here about our capacity to listen. All of this tends to point to an enormous communications challenge. And I wonder whether or not, in building the notion of resilience and creating an agenda for change, which will be truly absorbed into public consciousness, how this can be done without creating an open, inclusive information environment. And that must go beyond simply public relations and seeking to improve our image. So how do we make that a central part of this work? Unfortunately, I have to say, I've looked through all of the papers. It's alluded to, but it's not centrally part of the discussion.
Right. Thanks very much. So, panelists, you each, despite your extraordinary knowledge and depth of knowledge and understanding on each of these questions, you have only 2 minutes. So you cannot answer each and every question. So people can buttonhole you over coffee afterwards. But let's start from this end and go down the panel and give Filippo the last word.
Well,
so Silvio.
With our Iranian friend, I couldn't agree more. And I mentioned before also with regard to Assad, and this maybe goes also close to what we were saying before. I mean, we should get rid of our way of looking at things and explore those gray areas and compromise and see how we can work. I think one of the greatest success, as I said before, is the nuclear deal. I think is an amazing tool we have, and I think Iran is so important for the stabilization of the region, and I do hope we are not entering into a phase of, again, conflict with Iran. On austerity, I would like to get rid of this word because even my country, not to mention Greece, for example, has been hit so much about this, and there was a narrative around austerity. I would rather talk about discipline, because also our countries have to do their part and be disciplined at the same time. We mentioned also yesterday the flexibility and the fluidity in the world we are living in, and we have to be, in order to manage crisis, we need to be smart and to manage them accordingly.
Great, thanks. Ulrika.
So I will pick on the third comment on the communication challenge. I do think we have a communication challenge, and we need to find ways. And sometimes I also think that forums like this and all the networks and organizations that you represent, I mean, we need also to get out and bring people into the discussions. I was following, and it's still going on, actually, a discussion in UK where they have legislated for 0.7, the UN goal for international development cooperation, but then the government has had to diminish the budget in different areas of policies in the UK, and there is a debate on development cooperation in the tabloid media, which is so strange to follow. But all the different and think tanks and people who have been working in a quite well-financed sector of international relations and international development cooperation are not able to enter into this debate with all the knowledge that we have. So I think that we have a communication challenge. We need to bring forward the good examples, but circles like this one also need to open up and to make use of the knowledge and the networks that we have and enter into the debate, the more public debate. I think we are, and this is also part of the problem, and we are discussing it a lot, moving inside circles. So we need to break out of those circles and be part of the debate with the knowledge that we have, if we are complaining that it's not a very good discussion based on knowledge.
Thank you, Ulrika. And Filippo?
Yes, 2 points. First, there was an earlier remark made about the Cold War and the tools developed, and of course, you know, nobody, I think, is saying that the Cold War was a great time and now we have opportunities. The Cold War was a very problematic time. What I tried to say earlier is that the tools that indeed have been developed, and some were mentioned, will not function, and they are not functioning in the absence of political unity in pursuing certain goals, and in particular in pursuing common strategies to achieve peace. Syria is a case in point. No unity in the Security Council for 7 years has made the world unable to address that particular problem. And I think that that unity can only be achieved in a multipolar world, different from the Cold War, by that type of dialogue with all that our Iranian friend was talking about. So I think that, sorry, I'm moving into a realm that is absolutely not mine, that of politics, but I think that this is a very important point to make. The other point I wanted to make is that it is very important to invest in the right, to reflect on and invest in the right way in good governance. And I think that this is the point that the mayor of Rotterdam was mentioning. The complaint from public opinion in the Arab world, but indeed beyond that, is very much directed first and foremost at their own governments, seen as abusive and seen as corrupt and so forth. Now, traditionally, I think there's been two responses. One is to talk about elections, democratization top-down, importing models from the West in countries that are much more complex. That clearly has not proven a response, not least because it has been accompanied by actual support to regimes that are corrupt and are abusive in the name of global security and countering terrorism. So there is an important reflection to be made there. How do we really support good governance, which is what people want, and which is a powerful stabilization also in terms of population movements, refugees, and displacement crisis.
Thank you, Filippo, and thank you, everybody. And as director of a research institute that deals in information and hard data, I want to come to the point that you made and just say that all the evidence I have seen shows that at the heart of resilience is communication and trust. And if you don't get communication of reliable information across, have it understood, handled, acted upon, if there isn't the trust that makes that possible, you cannot build resilience. So that's my final word, apart from saying two things. One is that we have, if you check your timetable, you'll see that by being cruel to the panel, I have allowed you extra time for coffee and networking, which was deliberate on my part because 15 minutes is way too short. So enjoy the break. And the second thing is to say thank you very much to our panelists.